Hey everyone, welcome back. We are going to be continuing to read Lunch Money today. Remember, I am Miss Wagers, and we will go ahead and get started with chapter 23. For our learning intentions today, we are learning to use the elements of a narrative, like the character's thoughts, their words, their experiences, and then also key plot events, so that way we can determine the theme of a story. So we know we are successful when we can identify the character's thoughts, words, and their experiences, all those things, identify the key events in a story, and then also, of course, determine the theme of a story. And I will talk about what the theme is again at the end of the lesson in case you've forgotten, so don't fret. For foundational skills, remember that adding the suffix ion to a verb changes the word from a noun to a noun. That means the act of blanking or the condition of being blanked. So let's do a couple examples. You get what I'm talking about, okay? So, for example, the suffix ion. We have the base word discuss, and I have the suffix ion on there. So that means the act of being discussed, okay? Or we have invention, again, the suffix ion, the condition of being invented or the act of being invented, right? Pollution, the condition of being polluted, or imagination, the condition of being imagined, right? And then so on with decoration and deduction. So all of those changes a word into a noun. So an invention is a thing, it's a noun, right? But it's something that is invented. So for your fluency practice today, or your foundational skills practice, you have a fluency read with words that have the suffix ion. So for example, you have the word action, celebration, collection, complications, dedication, motivation, pollution, protection, starvation, and suffocation. Interesting. So the fluency read that you have today is called Cleaning Southport Beach. So again, you want to make sure that when you are doing these fluency reads that you are trying to make your reading nice and smooth. You're pausing at commas and at the periods at the ends of sentences, and really focusing on reading the words correctly. This is not a speed read, my friends. We do have a couple of vocabulary words, and the first one is confession, and that is a written or oral acknowledgement of guilt. So I pulled this GIF from the cartoon Hey Arnold, which was one of my favorites growing up. And we have Helga here, and she has always had a huge crush on Arnold. And so here she's like, confess your love to him. She's always trying to get herself to tell Arnold how much she loves him, even though really she picks on him all the time, right? So a confession is a written or oral acknowledgement of guilt, or like really just kind of like telling a secret, right? And then also I have another gift from Hey Arnold for this next word, privilege. So privilege we're going to see on page 208, and it is something regarded as a special honor. So here we have Phoebe, and she's saying that she's going to do her best with the title of hall monitor. And then Helga is saying, excuse me, make sure that I get my lunch line privilege. So Helga is, again, trying to have that special honor, probably trying to be the first in line for lunch. We are going to go ahead and get started with reading chapter 23 today. So make sure that you are following along and listening with attention, so that way you can do your best on your assignments today. Chapter 23 is called The Best Interests of the School. So it starts off here. Mrs. Davenport stood up and walked to the front table. Because remember, they're at the school committee meeting. Greg couldn't believe how small she looked. Seeing her walking around in a room full of other grown-ups, she only looked about half as big as she did at school. But when she began to talk, Mrs. Davenport seemed larger than life, just like always. She nodded toward Greg and Mara and said, "It was good to hear students from my school speak so clearly and intelligently, and it was good to hear my colleague, Mr. Xenotopoulos, speak as well. He and I have worked together for over 12 years now, and I have great respect for his talent and his love for the teaching profession. But I feel I must add something to what he said. I did not read comic books when I was a child, and neither did any of my brothers or sisters. Comic books were forbidden at our home. We had plenty of things to read, but always books. Real picture books and chapter books and novels. My mother felt that comic books were cheap and trashy. Those are her exact words. On long car trips, she read aloud to us books like Tom Sawyer and Charlotte's Web and The Swiss Family Robinson. Lots and lots of great books. We were not allowed to watch Saturday morning cartoons at my home either. Back then, I thought all of this was unfair. But by the time I reached college, I felt certain that a childhood without comic books and TV cartoons had been better and richer, not poorer. And as an elementary and intermediate school principal for the past 18 years, I have tried to uphold the highest standards of literacy in our libraries and classrooms. But before I go on, I have to make a confession. So there's that word confession. She's going to not admit guilt or say something that she's been hiding or keeping in. When I arrived home from school late yesterday afternoon, there was a package waiting for me. I don't know who sent it because there was no mailing label, no return address. When I opened the box, first I discovered this note. Please take a good look. And under the note, this is what I found. Mrs. Davenport walked back to her chair, leaned over, reached into a box, and then held up a small stack of comic books. Standing in the aisle and facing the audience, she said, "There were 20 or 30 of these in the box. My husband was thrilled because he remembered some of these from when he was a boy. And with some encouragement from him, I sat at home last night and I read comic books for the first time in my life. And here is my confession. I enjoyed myself. Please don't misunderstand me. Nothing will ever convince me that the 3 Supermen from Krypton and the Donald Duck in the Volcano Valley could be great children's literature. But I am ready to agree that a good comic book can be fun and basically harmless, as Mr. Xenotopoulos said." Greg was almost floating up out of his chair. He nudged Mara and whispered, "This is great!" But the principal wasn't done. Mrs. Davenport went back to the microphone and paused to look in the faces of the committee members. "However, I believe we have to think carefully about this question of what gets sold to children at our schools, and especially what children sell to one another. What if a student decides next week that she wants to set up a stand to sell her homemade dolls out by the buses before and after school? Will you give her permission? Or what if a boy decides to bring his baseball card collection to school so he can wheel and deal between classes? Try to imagine all the different things that children could dream up to sell to each other. Do we want our school to turn into a huge flea market? How can we give permission to this plan and then not accept others? As a principal, it is up to me to make sure that my school continues to be a place for learning, not a place for buying and selling." Greg looked around. A lot of people agreed with what Mrs. Davenport had just said. Mr. Z raised his hand. The chairperson nodded at him, and he stood up and said, "I agree with everything Mrs. Davenport is saying. School shouldn't become a place that's all about buying and selling. But it's partly about buying and selling, and we can't pretend it's not." All right. So guys, we're going to stop and pause for just a second. I really hope that you have been listening with attention. And I want you to think about this question. So it says that Mrs. Davenport has changed her mind about the value of comic books. How has her new opinion affected her opinion about the sale of chunky comics at school? So first off, how has Mrs. Davenport's opinion about comic books changed? Right? Did you notice that she's decided that not all comic books are bad? She says, "I don't think they're quality literature, but they're basically harmless," which is different than what she's thought about before. But has that changed her opinion about the sale of chunky comics? Right, I don't think so, because it still says that she doesn't think that school should be a place for buying or selling. So she still doesn't think that the sale of chunky comics at school is a good idea, right? So even though she's changed her opinion on comic books, she's still not supporting chunky comics, even though Greg was getting really excited thinking that was going to happen. Schools are supposed to prepare kids for a happy, successful life. And one important goal of our school system is to turn out graduates who have something of value they can offer the world, skills and talents and abilities that others will eventually pay them for. A math teacher gets paid money for teaching math. A principal gets paid money for running a school. And we all hope our students will one day be paid for their work too. So there's certainly nothing wrong with having kids learn about money and economics and profits and percentages. In fact, it would be wrong if we didn't teach them these things, which is why we teach units on economy and consumer education. What Greg and Mara had to offer should help other kids enjoy reading, just like the book clubs do. And their comics even go a step further because these mini comics will encourage student writing and student artwork. The regular book club companies provide a wholesome service that supports education, and that's why they're allowed to sell books at school and make a profit. And everyone agrees it's a right to get paid for work that's done well. These kids are asking for the same privilege. Plus, they've volunteered to donate a percentage of all their profits to the school library, which no book club has offered to do. Mrs. Davenport shook her head. I still have trouble with the idea of actually selling things right at school. But that's already happening, Mr. Z said. He turned to Greg and Mara. How many different companies did we find that are advertising or selling things directly to kids at Ashworth School? Greg said, a lot. Mara nodded and started counting them off on her fingers. There's a Domino's Pizza Day banner in the cafeteria, the Very Fine Juice machine, the Frito-Lay snack machine, the Powerade machine by the gym door, the Coca-Cola scoreboard on the playing field, the Nike book covers on all our social studies books, the Mars Candy fundraiser posters in the gym, the Wilson and Spalding and Adidas names on the sports equipment, and the big IBM letters on every clock in every room in the school. Greg said, and there are a ton of ads in all the magazines for the kids in the school library. Plus, all the sports biography books are ads for pro sports teams or NASCAR. And sometimes there are morning PA announcements about after-school bake sales or Saturday car washes at the high school. And there's the blue sweatshirt with the champion logo that Mr. Kellett wears during every gym class. And the Apple logo on almost every computer. And then there's the stuff sold at the school store. Plus, the book clubs. Mr. Z turned to the committee members and said, I don't like the way children are treated as sales targets, and I know none of you do either, but we have to face it. Selling to children is big business, and we have to help the kids understand this so they can make good decisions. I did some research, and do you know how much of their own money American kids in grades kindergarten through 6 spend every year? $13 billion. That's billion with a B. $13 billion of their own money, and that number grows every year. Greg was stunned. $13 billion? A week ago, Greg would have enjoyed that number. He'd have let that number slowly absorb into his entire mind. He would have let himself dream of grabbing huge hunks of that $13 billion for himself. But tonight, the number struck him differently. Greg suddenly saw that his giant plan for Chunky Comics was no more than a tiny speck, an almost invisible atom on the edge of a huge, whirling universe of money and products and buying and selling. Kids spent $13 billion last year, and part of that was spent by me. Greg kept careful records. He knew that during the past 12 months, he had spent over $400 of his own money, the biggest chunk for a new iPod, because I'm a sales target, me and every other kid in America. Mr. Z just said so. And sitting there at the front of the meeting room, Greg realized he'd been thinking of the kids at the school in the same way, as targets. He was the hunter and they were the prey. And what did he want from the school committee tonight? A hunting license. He wanted permission to aim his comic books at every kid in the school. And why? Was it to help the kids become better readers or to help them get interested in writing and drawing? Not really. Greedy Greg wanted to sell Chunky Comics so he could make money. Mr. Z was still talking. I'm glad that Greg and Mara got to sit through the whole meeting tonight. I'm proud to have them see how much care goes into every detail of what happens in our schools. And I want them to see that this is not an us against Mrs. Davenport, because that's not the way it works. We all want the same thing, what's best for the school and what's best for every student. Greg looked over at Mrs. Davenport, and she was nodding. Greg felt himself nodding too. Mr. Z said, this idea that Greg and Mara have, it's not some marketing plan that was drawn up in Los Angeles or Minneapolis or New York. It's homegrown. So I say it deserves our support. And whatever the school committee decides will be all right with me and with Greg and with Mara. But only if it's all right with Mrs. Davenport too, because we're all in this together. Mr. Z sat down and Mrs. Davenport said, I want to thank Mr. Xenotopoulos for that offer to work together on this, and I accept it. And we'll wait to hear the decision of the committee. As Mrs. Davenport stood and walked toward her seat, Mara got up and headed for the back of the room. Greg started to follow, but then stopped. He turned and faced the committee again. Could I say something else? He asked. The chairperson nodded at him, and Greg went to the microphone. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say, but he was sure of one thing, so that's what he said first. He gulped and said, If it's okay, I think I sort of want to change my idea. Greg felt the whole room get very quiet. The woman squinted and looked over the top of her glasses at him. You mean the comic book club? Change it? Now? Greg gulped again and said, "Yeah, I mean, yes, because what Mrs. Davenport said is right. It's not fair if Mara and I get special permission to sell our comic books, but then other kids can't sell things that they tried to make." A man at the front table said, "So what are you proposing?" Greg said, "Well, I think, really, there ought to be a way, like, if we..." Greg heard himself sputtering and stalling, saying nothing, and he knew why. He didn't really have a new idea, but he felt like something needed to change, and he knew it was now or never. From behind him, a voice said, "I think Greg's trying to say that the school store could be the answer." Greg turned around, and it was Mr. Z. Greg nodded slowly and then whipped back to face the school committee. Excited now, he said, "Yeah, that's right. Exactly. It's the school store." And making it up as he went along, Greg said, "Because we already have it, a store at school, in the cafeteria, except instead of just school supplies, we can sell our comics there. And other kids could sell their things there too, because lots of kids have good ideas. And the store can be like a business, a real business, except any kid who sells stuff at the store has to give 50%. 50% of all their profits go to something that helps the whole school, because that way it'll be half profit and half for learning. And that's my new idea, if it's okay." So again, let's stop and think for a second, you guys. Greg's changed his original business proposal. So he did this while he was reassessing his goals and motives. So what is that new proposal? What's his new idea? Right? Were you listening? Yeah, his new idea is to allow all the kids to sell things in their school store. Do you think that's a good idea? Say, what's your opinion? Think about it. Then Greg stood up, turned around, and headed for his seat. As he walked past the principal, he glanced at her face. She was smiling, and he smiled back, and she said, "Just a moment, Greg." She bent over, picked up a small cardboard box, and held it out to him. "The old comic books. I won't be needing these anymore." Greg blushed and started to say something back, but the chairperson was calling for the next speaker. Greg gave the principal an awkward smile, took the box, and hurried back to his chair. As Mrs. Davenport sat down, she couldn't help thinking, "He's a really remarkable boy. I'm proud of him." And as Greg sat down with a box of comics on his lap, he couldn't help thinking, $13 billion. Oh, that's a lot. So we're going to stop with our reading there today. Remember I said at the beginning of our lesson in our learning intentions that I would tell you about theme and what theme is in case you've forgotten. So readers can sometimes identify the theme by asking what a character learns by the end of the story or how the character changes. So we're really going to think about what has Greg learned or how has he changed, because the theme is the lesson or the author's message that they're trying to get you to understand through a story. So in order to do this, we want to think about how has Greg's opinion on money changed? And so I am going to use some key details from the text to help me determine the theme. So I'm thinking back in the story to what are some important things that have happened, some key details that show how Greg's opinion about money has changed. So the first thing that I came up with was that Greg thinks that selling to kids is like hunting them, and he's worried that he's been too greedy. Because remember in the text, it had said, Greg goes, he was the hunter and all the kids, his classmates, were the prey, and he was just trying to make money, and he didn't realize it at the time. But then he worries that, oh my gosh, I've been just like everyone else. I've been too greedy. Another key detail is that he realizes that he's just a sales target too. So he realizes that he's really just like the rest of the kids with all the advertising that's happening around him, with the logos on the sports, on the balls and the sports teams, with the signs and the vending machines around the school. So he realizes that he has become an advertising target as well, just like his classmates. So again, that's all helping him to realize a change in his opinion on money. And then he also tells the committee that he's changed his mind. So this is a big point in the story as well, where he's come to the school committee meeting wanting to be able to sell his comic books, but within that, he realizes that maybe that's not such a good idea, and he's changing his mind about this. So I'm purposely leaving the theme on this blank, because that is the part that you are going to be filling out or completing in your reading response today. So I want you to think about what's the overall lesson that Greg has learned, or how has he changed based on these key details and what we read in the story. So getting back to our learning intentions for today, we were learning to use the elements of a narrative like the character's thoughts, words, and experiences, and key plot events so we can determine the theme of a story. So we know we're successful when we can identify the character's thoughts, words, and experiences. So that's actually what we are really focusing on with Greg and how he was working through the school committee meeting and how his opinion was changing on money. We also, of course, identified some of those key events in the story in our graphic organizer, and then determining the theme of the story. So the character's thoughts, words, and experiences, we've done that. Check. The key events, again, we put those in that graphic organizer. Check. And then you are going to hopefully check off determining the theme of the story. So what lesson has Greg learned? How has his opinion about money changed? So hopefully, check, that is going to you. And lastly, of course, your reading response. So I even put in your reading response again. The theme is a theme is something a character learns by the end of the story or how a character changes. How Greg's ideas about money changed. So you're going to get this slide, and then I'm also going to give you what I had put in the graphic organizer to help you think about how his ideas of money have changed. All right, that is all for today. I hope you guys have a great day. Do all of your work, be kind to one another, and I will see you guys in the next time. Bye.